The drought had been going on 14 months. 14 months of watching the sky promise rain that never came, of hauling water in 50-gallon drums to keep the cattle from dying, of watching his neighbors pack up and head to Tulsa or Oklahoma City for work that paid in money instead of hope. The Weatherford Ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, and Ben had always believed the land would provide, the way his daddy and granddaddy had taught him. But the earth had other plans. Martha had tried. Lord knows she'd tried. She'd taken a job at the diner in town, serving coffee and pie to truckers and oil field workers, bringing home $60 on a good day. She'd planted a garden that withered before the tomatoes could blush red. She'd sat with him on this same porch, night after night, listening to the cattle lowing in the distance, their voices thin and desperate in the still air. "I can't do this any more, Ben," she'd said that morning, her suitcase already packed and sitting by the front door. "I can't watch you disappear a little more every day, and I can't disappear with you." He'd wanted to argue, to tell her about the clouds he'd seen building on the western horizon yesterday, about how the old-timers said droughts always broke eventually. But the words felt as dry as the creek bed, so he just nodded and helped her load the suitcase into the truck. Now the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of rust and regret. Ben walked down the porch steps and across the yard to where Sand Creek used to run. Used to sing, Martha had always said. The creek bed stretched before him like an open wound, filled with nothing but smooth stones and the skeletons of cottonwood branches. He'd played in this creek as a boy, caught his first fish here, kissed Martha for the first time on the wooden bridge his grandfather had built across it. The cattle gathered near the dry creek bed every evening, as if they remembered water and still hoped it might return. 23 head left from the 45 he'd started the year with. The rest sold off to pay bills or dead from the heat. Their ribs showed through their dull coats, and their eyes held the same hollow look Ben saw in the mirror every morning. He knelt and picked up a smooth stone from the creek bed, rolling it between his calloused palms. The rock was warm from the day's heat, and he could see the watermarks on it, pale rings that showed where the creek had once run high and clear. In the distance, a mockingbird called from the dead elm tree, its song echoing off the empty land. The dust cloud from Martha's pickup truck hung in the air long after her taillights disappeared, settling on Ben Holloway's cracked lips like the taste of everything he'd failed to hold on to. The days blurred together like heat waves on asphalt. Ben went through the motions of ranch work, checking the cattle, repairing fence where the posts hadn't rotted out completely, hauling water from the well that was dropping lower every week. The pump wheezed and groaned, bringing up water that tasted of minerals and desperation. In town, people looked through him. At the feed store, old Pete Morrison would nod and take his money but wouldn't meet his eyes. The banker, Harold Stevens, had stopped calling about the overdue loan payments, which somehow felt worse than the threats had. Even Reverend McKinney, who'd baptized Ben in Sand Creek 28 years ago, seemed to find reasons to look away when their paths crossed. But it was Sarah Chen who surprised him. Sarah had moved to town 2 years ago to teach at the elementary school, one of those young idealists who thought she could make a difference in a place most people were trying to leave. She lived in the small rental house behind the post office, the one with the chain-link fence and the struggling rose bush by the front gate. Ben was coming out of the hardware store, a bag of fence staples in his hand, when he nearly collided with her on the sidewalk. She was carrying a canvas grocery bag and a mason jar filled with something that looked like soup. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I was just thinking about you." He stopped, surprised. Most people in town had stopped thinking about him months ago, or at least stopped admitting they had. "I made too much vegetable soup," she continued, holding out the mason jar. "And I remembered Martha mentioning once that it was your favorite." The jar was still warm in his hands. He could smell carrots and celery, onions, and something else that reminded him of his mother's kitchen. Sarah's dark eyes were kind but not pitying, which made all the difference. "You don't need to," he started, but she waved him off. "Mrs. Holloway used to help me with my garden when I first moved here," Sarah said. "Showed me which plants could handle the heat. This is just paying it forward. She turned to go, then looked back over her shoulder. The creek bed's been looking different lately, she said. Greener somehow. Like maybe the roots are finding water deeper down. Ben watched her walk away, her dark hair catching the afternoon sun. That evening, he heated the soup on his propane camp stove. The electricity had been shut off 2 weeks ago, and ate it slowly, tasting kindness in every spoonful. Then he walked down to Sand Creek and looked more carefully at the bed than he had in weeks. Sarah was right. There was something different. Not water, not yet, but a subtle change in the color of the stones, a dampness in the air that hadn't been there before. And along the edges of the creek bed, tiny shoots of grass were pushing up through the cracked earth, pale green and stubborn as hope. Ben had always been an early riser, but since Martha left, he'd taken to getting up even before dawn, when the air still held a hint of coolness and the world felt less broken somehow. It was on one of these mornings, 3 weeks after Sarah had given him the soup, that he heard it. He was walking toward the creek with his first cup of coffee, black and bitter because the milk had gone sour and he'd forgotten to buy more. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, painting the horizon the pale gray of old pewter. And there, so soft he almost thought he'd imagined it, was the sound of water moving over stone. Ben stopped walking, coffee cup halfway to his lips, and listened. Nothing. Just the morning wind through the dried grass and the distant lowing of cattle. He shook his head and took another step, and there it was again. A whisper, a murmur, the sound of something alive where nothing should be alive. He ran the last 50 yards to the creek bed, coffee sloshing out of his cup and burning his hand. And there, threading its way between the smooth stones like a silver ribbon, was a thin trickle of water. Not much. He could step across it easily. But it was moving, flowing east toward where Sand Creek used to join the Canadian River. Ben knelt beside the tiny stream and cupped his hands, bringing the water to his lips. It was cold and tasted of earth and sky, of underground places where the sun couldn't reach. He sat back on his heels and stared at this impossible thing, this thread of hope that had appeared overnight like a gift from a god he'd almost stopped believing in. For the first time since Martha left, Ben cried. Not the angry tears he'd shed in the first days, or the bitter ones that had come when the bank notice arrived. These were different, deep and cleansing, like rain on parched ground. He cried for Martha and the children they'd never had, for the land that was failing him, for the man he'd been before the drought had stripped away everything he thought he knew about himself. When the tears stopped, Ben followed the creek upstream, walking carefully along its banks. The water seemed to be seeping up from underground, finding its way through cracks in the rock and gaps between the stones. It wasn't a spring, exactly, more like the earth itself was bleeding moisture, drop by precious drop. The sun was fully up by the time he made it back to the house. He found Sarah Chen sitting on his front porch, another mason jar in her lap and a thermos of coffee beside her on the step. "I brought breakfast," she said simply. "Scrambled eggs and toast. Figured you might not be eating regular meals." Ben looked down at himself. His jeans caked with mud from kneeling by the creek, his shirt soaked with sweat and tears, his boots wet from walking in the impossible water. He must have looked like a madman. "The creek," he said, his voice hoarse. "There's water in the creek." Sarah smiled, and it was like watching the sun come up. "I know," she said. "I've been watching it grow stronger every morning for a week. Didn't want to say anything until you found it yourself." She stood and brushed off her jeans. "Some things you have to discover on your own time," she said. "But once you do, it's okay to share them with someone else." The trickle became a stream, and the stream became something more. Not a river. Ben wasn't fool enough to believe in miracles, but a steady flow of water that brought the creek bed back to life. Fish appeared first, small minnows that must have survived somehow in pools underground. Then frogs, their evening chorus a sound Ben had forgotten he missed. The cottonwoods along the banks began to green up, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. Sarah came by most evenings, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just bringing herself. She'd sit with Ben on the porch or walk with him along the creek, pointing out the new life that seemed to appear daily. A family of raccoons that came to drink at dusk. A great blue heron that stood motionless in the shallows, fishing with the patience of prayer. Wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and evening primrose, that bloomed in impossible profusion along the water's edge. "It's like the land was just waiting," Sarah said one evening as they watched the sun set over the creek. "All that life was there the whole time, just sleeping until the water came back." Ben nodded, understanding something he couldn't quite put into words. The drought hadn't ended. The sky was still clear, the earth still hard as concrete beyond the creek's influence. But something had shifted, some underground current of possibility that he'd thought was lost forever. The cattle were the first to notice the change in him. They still came to the creek to drink, but they no longer carried that hollow-eyed desperation. Ben found himself talking to them again, calling them by name instead of just counting heads. He fixed the fence properly instead of patching it with whatever was handy. He painted the barn door, replacing the peeling red with fresh paint that blazed like hope in the morning sun. Word spread through town about the creek, the way news always traveled in small places, quietly but thoroughly. People drove out to see for themselves, some believing, some skeptical, all curious about this impossible resurrection of water from dust. The local newspaper even sent a reporter, a young man from Oklahoma City who wrote about anomalous groundwater emergence and geological curiosities, but missed the real story entirely. The real story was Ben, standing knee-deep in Sand Creek on a morning in late October, clearing fallen branches from the water's path. The real story was the way he'd started sleeping through the night again, the way he'd learned to cook more than just canned soup and burnt coffee. The real story was Sarah, laughing as a school of minnows scattered around her bare feet, and Ben realizing he was laughing too. Martha called on a Tuesday, her voice small and distant over the phone. She'd heard about the creek from her sister in town, wanted to know if it was true. Ben told her it was, told her about the fish and the frogs and the way the cottonwoods were turning gold in the autumn light. "I'm happy for you," she said, and he could hear that she meant it. "I always loved that creek." "I know," Ben said. "It loved you too." There was a long silence, filled with all the things they couldn't say, all the ways they'd both changed since that dusty morning when she'd driven away. "Maybe someday," Martha said finally. "Maybe," Ben agreed, and found he could mean it without desperation, without the hollow ache that had lived in his chest for so many months. After he hung up, Ben walked down to the creek one more time before dark. The water caught the last light of day, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Sarah was there, as he'd somehow known she would be, sitting on the bank with her shoes off and her feet in the flowing water. "Listen," she said softly. Ben listened. The creek was singing again, not the full-throated song it had sung in wet years, but a quiet melody of water over stone, of life finding its way back to places it belonged. In the distance, a mockingbird called from the green elm tree, its voice carrying across the water like a blessing. "Who's left to hear it?" Sarah asked, echoing his own thoughts from months ago. Ben sat beside her, letting his own feet find the cool water. "We are," he said simply. "We're here to hear it." The creek flowed past them in the gathering darkness, carrying its small but persistent song toward the river, toward the sea, toward whatever tomorrow might bring. And for the first time since the drought began, Ben felt the future flowing too, not rushing like a flood, but steady and sure as the water at his feet, finding its way back to where it belonged. If Ben's story touched your heart, if it reminded you that sometimes the smallest changes can mean everything, or if it gave you hope that dried-up places in your own life might find their way back to flowing again, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that water always finds a way. Subscribe to our channel. We tell stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary grace in the quiet corners of America, proving that healing can come from the most unexpected places. Until next time, keep listening for the whisper of water over stone. Sometimes that's all it takes to start flowing again.